video, we'll be exploring the impact of one of the most significant epidemic diseases to shape world history, and that is smallpox. In the words of medical historian Roy Porter, epidemics arose with society, and sickness has been, and will remain, a social product no less than the medicine which opposes it. Civilization brings not just discontents, but diseases. Paleolithic society, or society prior to the advent of farming, saw very few epidemic diseases. People lived in small groups and practiced nomadic lifestyles in which they weren't in one place long enough to pollute the environment. They had no domesticated animals, which are themselves sources of epidemic diseases, and they ate a relatively healthy diet. But the advent of farming, the Neolithic Revolution, changed all of that. As farming brought civilization and brought with it permanent settlements, large social groups, close contact with animals, and monoculture diets, humans came into contact with new pathogens. Some of those pathogens, like influenza or tuberculosis, came from animals. Others, like cholera or typhoid, came from a contaminated water supply. And still others, like malaria, came from insect and vermin that infested human civilizations. And these pathogens and the diseases they brought with them often affected human civilizations that were nutritionally deficient, whether because of food shortages or because a reliance on monoculture had resulted in vitamin or nutrient deficiencies. So the pathogens that brought epidemic diseases brought destruction into human societies. And we've named a few, but there are hundreds of others. Measles, polio, hepatitis, diphtheria, whooping cough. The list goes on and on. But what we want to do today is to take a look at one of the deadliest and most destructive epidemic diseases in human history: smallpox. The primary form of smallpox that has affected human civilizations is caused by the variola virus. Its symptoms begin with flu-like symptoms, and then those flu-like symptoms give way to a rash across the body. The rash results in skin sores that fill with a thick, opaque liquid that eventually form pustules. The pustules form a crust and scab over, and then within a few days those scabs fall off, typically leaving scars. Smallpox throughout history has been highly lethal and highly contagious, killing about 30% of the people it infected and leaving others scarred, sterile, or, if the pox virus infected the eyes, blinded by the effects of smallpox. Less common strains, like hemorrhagic smallpox, had a fatality rate much closer to 100%. So it was an incredibly deadly and destructive virus. Smallpox was eradicated from the world in 1979, making it the first epidemic disease completely eradicated in world history. But before that, smallpox was responsible for billions of deaths. Estimates rest at about 300 to 500 million in just the 20th century. And smallpox dates much further back than that. So smallpox and the destruction wrought by smallpox has defined human history in many ways. It's believed that the disease originated about 10,000 years ago in Africa, particularly in Eastern Africa, and then spread throughout the ancient world. A 2015 article from the journal Viruses suggests that the variola virus emerged in East Africa as a mutation of a closely related virus that evolved as the domesticated camel emerged as a new host. This virus developed into repeated epidemics within a few millennia and ravaged human civilizations, human populations across the globe. There's evidence of Egyptian mummies bearing the scars of pox. Descriptions of what appear to be smallpox appear in medical treatises. There are mentions in Chinese and Indian literature. The mortality rate in these ancient civilizations and in future generations was exceptionally high, so many societies developed the custom of not naming infants until after they'd survived the pox virus. So smallpox spread from Africa into Asia, and then from Asia into Europe. Smallpox appeared in large parts of Europe by the Middle Ages, and there are contemporary accounts of the disease decimating populations across Europe. So the spread of smallpox is closely connected to the movement of people across regions and continents in world history, and that would continue into the early modern period as well, as the Europeans spread smallpox into the Americas, where the devastation was even greater. In the so-called Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa, the most common form of smallpox killed perhaps 30% of its victims, while blinding and disfiguring many others. But the effects were even worse in the Americas, where the indigenous populations had little to no immunity to the disease. They'd had no exposure to smallpox prior to the arrival of the Europeans at the end of the 15th century, and therefore had developed no resistance to the disease. And so smallpox ripped through Native American populations, devastating the Inca, devastating the Aztecs. Historians believe that smallpox and other European diseases reduced the indigenous populations of North and South America by as much as 90%, making it a blow far greater than any military defeat or any advantage from military weaponry. So it's fair to say, as historian Jared Diamond has, that disease was, if not the decisive factor, at the very least a crucial determinant in Europeans' dominance in the modern era. The ability of smallpox to weaken the native populations opened them up to easy conquest by the European colonists and allowed Europe to establish dominance over the Americas. And that dominance and use of smallpox as a weapon would continue. In fact, there are suggestions that Lord Geoffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in North America during the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in North America, even advocated handing out smallpox-infected blankets to his Native American foes in 1763. So smallpox was not only at the center of migrating populations and at the center of connections between civilizations, but was defined and used by conflict between civilizations. It would shape the nature of history, not only in the ancient and medieval worlds, but in the early modern and modern worlds as well. Fortunately, it was the first epidemic disease to be completely eradicated from the face of the earth, in large part due to the long incubation period of the disease, and in large part due to experimentation with vaccines. The concept of inoculation, and inoculation more or less means exposing an individual to small amounts of a disease in order to create immunity, was well known in Africa, India, and China by the 17th century. It gained popularity in Europe by the 18th century. Smallpox became one of the first targets of inoculation, and the risky procedure proved to be fairly successful, killing just a small fraction of those it infected and resulting in much milder forms of the disease for those who had been inoculated. In Asia, the very first attempts at inoculation against smallpox were a practice called variolation. And variolation was the deliberate infection of an individual with a very small dose of the smallpox virus. The belief was that exposure to this very small amount of the pathogen would produce immunity to the disease and render anyone who got the disease later, would give them a much milder case of the disease. So what they basically did was they took dried smallpox scabs and crushed it up into a fine powder. That powder was then inhaled through the nostril of the person being inoculated, and they fell prey to a very mild form of the disease. Once they'd recovered, they were mostly immune to smallpox. Between 1 and 2% of the population, of the inoculated population, died from smallpox, compared to 30% of the population at large. So by 1700, the concept of variolation had spread from China into other parts of Asia, Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and then into Europe. In 1796, a new discovery was made by a man named Edward Jenner, a British doctor. He noticed that women, in particular, who had developed cowpox, and cowpox was a related virus, closely related to smallpox, but women who had developed cowpox were largely resistant to the smallpox disease. And so he noticed this among dairy-maid populations and decided to experiment and see if his theory was correct. So what he did was he deliberately injected a young boy with a small dose of cowpox to see if it too would create immunity to smallpox. And it was successful, leading to the establishment of what medical historians call vaccination. Because this boy did not get sick, vaccination became an important practice in the European medical community. Further testing proved conclusively that cowpox virus was able to build immunity, and that became the go-to for smallpox vaccinations. Through global efforts, smallpox was completely eradicated by 1979 and is no longer a concern within the world at large. But the story of smallpox reveals the power of disease to shape world history, to shape economies, to shape politics. And it offers lessons for the modern world in the face of the myriad epidemic diseases that we are facing today. Thank you.